So we're going to talk about types of sampling, and it's pretty, I'll say straightforward, because most of the terms have pretty reasonable definitions. Nothing's overly complicated, and some of them have enough gray area where you would think maybe something is like a block design. You can make a case for another type of sampling, and I'll explain what all that means in a minute. But I first wanted to talk about the two ambiguous types, and that is anecdotal evidence and available data. All right. Anecdotal evidence is the worst kind. Well, actually, it's right there with the worst kind. Voluntary response samples are the worst kind, but anecdotal evidence is in the neighborhood of that. Right? Evidence collected haphazardly, so already you know it's not a positive thing, with no real connection to the population. It's not representative of the population. An example of this is polling your friends. I'm just going to underline your friends, because that's the key part of it, for their opinion on smoking on school grounds. All right. So, regardless of the fact that your friends may be or may not be smokers, the fact that they're your friends does not make them representative of the population, right? Because what that would mean is that the population can be defined based off of their relationship to you, all right? Whether or not they're your friends. And so if the only people that you're asking for their opinion would be your friends, then that would be the only people that your results would apply to, right? So you couldn't say, well, everybody wants the policy to change. We want to be able to smoke on school grounds because I collected data, I had a study, I conducted this statistical analysis related to smoking on school grounds, and I determined that people want to be able to smoke on school grounds. All right. How did you collect your data? Well, I just asked all my friends. Well, that's not going to fly, all right? Because again, it's not representative of the population. And there's also the added element that, how did you ask your friends? Did you ask your friends while you're all outside having a smoke? If that's the case, then it really is skewed, right? But my favorite one is for anecdotal evidence. I had a student after the most recent test in my high school calculus class. He said, I'll try to paraphrase it, but I'll try to also use the language. He said words to the effect of, is there going to be a curve on this test? Because tons of people didn't do well on it. Like, he used tons of people. That's not something I would say. It's like awkward language. But that's what he said. And my response is I don't want to say I come out swinging with stuff like that, but I come out very specifically and identify the fallacies that exist in that kind of statement. Right? So I identified for him, without using the term anecdotal evidence, that what he was looking at was anecdotal evidence. Because generally what happens after a test, when somebody says that everybody failed, it's usually not that's the case. It's that you and your three closest friends failed. Everybody else did perfectly fine. Right? It's just the people that you spoke to were the ones that did poorly. All right? So that falls into the anecdotal evidence. So what happened was, after he took his test and got a bad grade, he asked people how they did. The people that he asked were his friends, which were also the people that he prepared for the test with. And I use the term prepared loosely. It turned out that the class average was like an 85. And that literally the only people who failed were him and his three closest friends, right? But in his perception, in his world, everybody failed because everybody he spoke to failed. But who he spoke to is not representative of the population, right? So, you could apply that to any test. You do poorly. Part of you is hoping that everybody else did poorly too, so that you could say, well, we're all in this together. Let's band together against the teacher, and maybe he'll curb it for us. But in my classes, anyway, and I've also been in the opposite situation where I've been in a class where everybody really did fail, But for my classes, it's never the case. The class average is usually around an 80, with a standard deviation usually around 10, and that there's a couple of people who got a grade that was different from that, and unfortunately they talked to the other people who got grades that were similar to theirs. But that's just how it goes. And so you put out those little fires as they emerge. But I have been in a situation where, specifically it was a psych class. I remember psychology. That was pretty much every time it happened, it was in a psych class. You take a test, there was 100 multiple choice questions, no exaggeration, 100 multiple choice questions. And the class average was like literally a 20. All right, so 20% of the questions correct. So the teacher's curving the test. Right? And that's how I feel about things. Like, if I ever gave a test where everybody failed, that's on me. Then we relearn the material and we take a make-up test. But that has never happened. Yeah, but in a psych class, it happens all the time, apparently. Because what they did at that point was they took the highest score that was earned by any student in the class, and they made that the 100. And they scaled everything based off of that number, right? So as you find out later on, they never expected anybody to do well on it. They always expected to curve it, because psychology is such a dense subject area that, like, to know every aspect of it after 2 weeks is not possible, right? So what they're looking for is relative standing within the population. And so part of psychology is actually learning about standard deviations, means, some statistical concepts. So I found out after the fact, actually when I was a teacher, that the test itself was a lesson in relative standing. Like, the teacher designed it on purpose so that everyone would fail, and then they would redefine it based off of the high score. And so everybody could understand that it's not always about what you earned in terms of a percentage, it's where you are compared to those around you, right? So I was like, oh, that's interesting. It didn't make me feel any better when I got a 19 out of 100, but it was interesting, So for me, I don't do multiple choice typically, and so there's always free response, partial credit, and stuff like that. So the class average almost always is an 80, with almost always a standard deviation of 10. I didn't give you your test back yet, right? No, I'll give those back later. But you all did very well as a class. Class average was, I think, for this test, higher than I've ever had for a probability test. So, and then I spit coffee all over the place. So that's the price I pay, I guess. But yeah. So we could even look at that data and see and talk about relative standing and things like that. But yeah, yeah. So anyway, I kind of got sidetracked there. But yeah, I mean, it does a good job of speaking to anecdotal evidence, because nobody understands this topic. Well, is it really the case that nobody understands it? No, you're overgeneralizing. There's 2 or 3 people that don't understand it, but it's important, as a teacher, I want to know if 2 or 3 people don't understand it, because I want to help those 2 or 3 people. All right. But if nobody understands something, then it's probably because I didn't teach it, at all. All right. So, but yeah, that's the classic educational example of anecdotal evidence. You can think of other situations in real life. It happens all the time. I mean, I've been using anecdotal evidence all semester. Can anybody think of the anecdotal evidence that I've been using? It's related to driving. I say it at least 2 or 3 times every class. There's a certain kind of driver that's worse than every other kind, certain kind of car. Audi drivers. I said it 3 times already today. I find a way to squeeze it in every class. And fortunately, I have videos of my lectures. I could find, it would take a while, but I could find the moments that I've said it, right? Audi drivers are the worst. Yeah, now you got to watch them.
Specifically said, if someone's driving to work, speeding in their Audi.
Exactamundo. Yeah. Right after Audi is BMW drivers, and after that is Hyundai. I'm sorry, no, sorry, I misspoke. I don't want to offend the Hyundai drivers. They're actually not that bad. I meant to say Kia. Kia, killed in accident. That's what it stands for.
I don't want to get too in the weeds on this, but I just ran a sexual harassment response seminar at work, because we have to do this by like December 1st to we're out of compliance. And I was getting back the feedback forms, and they have like 4 or 5 questions, you know, mostly about the seminar itself. But then at the end, the last question was, how do you feel that your company will respond with a complaint? And I work in a male-dominated field, and there's, you know, it's a factory, and we have welders and carpenters, and there's probably a 20, maybe if that many % women workforce. And these things are anonymous, but you can see, you know, it's like 55552.
Right.
You know, so if you think a woman is answering that, is that evidence of anecdotal evidence just because the guys are like, well, we've never had a problem. You know,
right.
I don't imagine I would have a problem if I reported something.
It's a matter of perception. So it's probably not anecdotal evidence, because it's how they are directly asking how you perceive a situation. Now, if you were to say, like, you were to draw a conclusion and say, I am not going to be supported because I am female in this, you know, then that's anecdotal evidence, because there's no basis for that. All right. Now, there's common sense basis for it, but there's no statistical basis for it. Now, what they're trying to do is take something that might be anecdotal and make it not that. So if all the females were to say that they're not going to get supported, or they don't perceive that they'll get supported, then they can go from making that an anecdotal statement to, now we have data to support it, because we polled every female in the population and this is what they said, right? Now the responses just going to management?
They're going to the people that that presented.
Oh, okay.
So it's mostly for their metrics, but we get it, you know, we're going to have that stuff on file.
Yeah, that's the other thing. You know, so that part might be anecdotal, because it's like a perception of, well, they're going to use this, they're going to put it in our files. Like, there's no basis to think that except for common sense. You know, like, so statistically it's anecdotal, but there's grounds for thinking that way. You know, so that's tricky. That's gray area. Yeah, and also, you know, if it's male dominated and there's only a certain number of females, that's a tough spot to be in, because then it's like you put, no, I'm not going to be supported, and then they're like, well, there's that, you know what, that said that they don't trust us, you know, like, that's tricky. Oof, it's setting you up. And that's anecdotal. Now, available data produced in the past to answer someone else's question, but can be also used to answer, or to use for your own study. That could be fine. There's nothing wrong with having available data. What I mean by that is, you know, because you might look at this and say, well, isn't all data available? That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is data that's part of somebody else's statistical analysis. All right, so somebody else, like maybe a former student of mine, conducted a study and collected the data properly. It has to be properly. If they collected it using anecdotal evidence, then forget it. But if they collected it properly and you just want to do something different with that data, that's perfectly okay. All right, so Audi drivers. So like if somebody collected data related to the driving habits for different car owners, so like they have Audi drivers, BMW drivers, and Kia drivers. And then you throw in like the best drivers, which are of course Honda drivers. All right, so you have those individuals in there. All right, so I run the study.
I would say Honda and Toyota.
Toyota's probably right up there.
Maybe it's the Mercedes and the BMW
In other words.
You know what? I haven't experienced much with the Mercedes.
Do you drive?
Was that?
What do you drive?
I think you know. You couldn't glean from my previous statement?
I want to hear from you.
I drive a Honda, of course. Of course I do. I'm a safe driver. It's obvious. So like it's a cause and effect relationship. If I am a safe driver, then therefore I must be a Honda driver. Right? So that's just how it works. But yeah, like so I conduct a study, I collect all that information, and I want to show that Honda drivers are the best. And so I'm painting all those other drivers in a bad light, obviously. Right? But then somebody else might see that same data set and say, wait a minute, I'm a Kia driver. I'm the safest type of driver out there. So let me use that same data set. I'm going to analyze it differently, and I'm going to attempt to draw a different conclusion. That's how one might use available data. Right? So same data set, looking for a different outcome. All right? And it's not cheating. That's the thing. That's the beauty of statistics. Because Mark Twain said that there are lies, damned lies, in statistics. He also said that statistics are pliable. Right? So we're looking at a situation where, like you can make the numbers tell you whatever you want. I mean, I've seen some fuzzy math when it comes to statistics before, where they'll show me a data set, specifically in like faculty meetings, and they'll say, well, clearly this means, and I'm like, well, clearly it doesn't. Like, where did you get that from? And they say, well, if you look at it this way. I'm like, but nobody in their right mind would look at it that way, except if they want to prove the point that you're trying to prove. And so that's really what happens, is that I can take that same data set, use it for something completely different, and be perfectly correct. All right? Multiple right answers with the same data set. It all depends on what you're looking for. So available data can be a good thing, and also it could be a controversial thing, because if you find some study out there, and the big cause these days is climate and sustainability and stuff like that. Like I showed that survey before. Some people pay a lot of lip service to it, but then there are people that are demonstrating down on Wall Street. So there's different things like, oh, I'll make sure to put the plastics in the plastic recycling bin, and then there's other people that are like picketing in front of the governor's mansion. So there's different levels of it, but it's all the same idea. And so a person might look at a data set related to weather and say, well, I want to prove that the climate is changing in a detrimental way, and other people would look at it and say, I could use the same data and show the opposite outcome, right? So nothing wrong with that, right? But the stronger answer is the one that convinces more people, right? Because that's the thing, like, I can do all the math, but I'm sitting in that faculty meeting, and the principal is sharing his PowerPoint with this data set and all the conclusions he's drawing, and I'm looking around and I'm seeing all these heads nodding. And I'm like, well, it doesn't matter what I say, they're already convinced, right? He's absolutely wrong. His math doesn't make any sense, but I'm seeing the heads nod, all right? So the correct answer is the one that convinces the most people, right? So that's where statistics gets in the gray, right? In order to be an appropriate study, and this is where most people's analyses fall flat, it has to do with sampling. If you don't sample correctly, then it's all over, right? Simple random sample is the best kind of sample, right? It's completely randomized. There's no bias in it whatsoever. The problem is it's often challenging to implement, right? Because if a simple random sample is just putting all the names of the people in your study, assuming it is people, in a hat, and then drawing the names of the people that you want out at random. Right? The problem with that is you have to have all the names of the people available to put in the hat. So if I'm sampling from the human population, I need all 7+ billion names to put in the hat in order to randomly select. Okay, so that's not happening, right? So what I might do is break it down a little smaller, like US Census Bureau versus the Parisian Census Bureau, whatever they call themselves, and have them collect data and then just share the information from one group to another, right? That's a blocking design, right? So we're breaking it up by nation, right? And then they're selecting randomly from within their own population. And then we compile that all together to come up with what would be representative. But the issue that goes along with that is, it goes back to what I was saying before. If I have 100,000 people that represent my sample of the human race, and it isn't dominated percentage-wise by people from Asia, then my data is already skewed, all right? Because I'm not going to get something conclusive, right? Or at least, I mean, it could be conclusive, it just could be flat out wrong, right? So sometimes what we do is we have a randomized block design, form blocks from a sample, randomly assign treatments to individuals within the block. That's assuming that you're conducting an experiment. But even that has its drawbacks, because if you have a large enough population, that could be a problem, right? For our purposes, we want to keep our populations relatively small, right? So when you're thinking of a study, I mean, as much as you might want to change the world, defining your population as the population of the human race is not gonna work. You're not gonna get it done, all right? Think smaller. I had a student who conducted a study on heights in the supermarket of sugary snacks and things like that. It's basically sugar-based products, right? Because what the hypothesis was is that the unhealthy things are placed at eye level for children, so that they can look at it and say, I want that. If it's placed on the top shelf, they'll never see it and therefore never want to buy it, right? And a funny byproduct of that is what I call cereal eyes. And so if you ever look at a box of cereals, the sugary ones, they always have a cartoon character on them, right? Like Trix and things like that. And the eyes are always pointing down, right? So even if they're placed on a higher shelf, the eyes are always facing down, so that when the kid looks up at it, they're looking into the eyes of the character, right? They're designed to subliminally manipulate the kid into wanting that cereal, right? But you don't see that on Wheaties. You know, there's no cartoon character, and if there's no cartoon character, there's no eyes looking at the kid, right? So it's a marketing strategy designed to get them to purchase the expensive sugar design, right? So that study was a pretty cool study. Now that student did not go around the entire country polling Stop and Shops everywhere. He just focused on Westchester County, right? Just found the Stop and Shops in Westchester County, focused specifically on Stop and Shop. That's another thing, right? And then came up with a way of determining the height. So the height wasn't like inches off the floor, it was the shelf number. Shelf 1, 2, 3, or 4, or 5, however many there are, right? And so that was the basis of the student's analysis, and it was very interesting, right? So the randomized block design is really more like, not necessarily you're breaking it up into control and experimental group, but really you're taking your population and breaking it up into different categories, all right? So in this case, in the case of the cereals, you might look at it as, okay, my population is all the sugary snacks that might exist in Stop and Shop, all right? Group 1 could be all the cereals. Group 2 could be all the cookies or crackers. Group 3 could be all the breakfast products. And group 4 could be all the dessert products or dinner products or something like that, all right? And so the individuals that are selected from those groups randomly could be, you know, like Lucky Charms, Trix, you know, maybe Pop-Tarts if you're looking at the breakfast stuff, right? So, I'm sorry, the frozen breakfast stuff. So that's one way in which you could select from within each block, all right, to create your sample. So in that way, randomized block design and stratified can be somewhat confused, right? Because they have a similar structure, except the randomized block design, it's really more for people, because you're breaking your population up into different categories and then breaking those categories up into control and experimental groups, so specifically for an experiment. If you're doing the cereal study, the Stop and Shop study, then you're probably doing a stratified random sample, right? The population is all the Stop and Shops, and then the different categories of, you know, products within the Stop and Shop, and then you're sampling from within each of those categories. Now, if you have enough time on your hands, then maybe you don't even have to sample from each one. You could go through and identify every cereal that's kid-oriented and what shelf it's on. And the reality is, they're probably all going to be on the same shelf or a similar shelf, right? You're not going to see Lucky Charms on the top shelf. You're going to see it on the first or second shelf, maybe the third shelf, tops, right? But it probably wouldn't be too terrible to collect data for all of the cereals because they're probably all in the same location, right? Same idea for like lunch and dinner snacks and things like that, right? So, but if it is overwhelming, if there is a ton of products, then you would randomly select which ones that you want to include, right? So the way you would handle that is, that's why we were learning about simulators on the calculator. You would create a raw list of different cereals. So you got your Lucky Charms, you got your Trix, you got your honeycombs, if that's still a thing. Yeah, basically anything you could think of. Make a list, assign a number to each one of those, and use a random number generator. You know, like how we did with dice and marbles and stuff like that, to select a certain amount of values from those cereals. And then you go to the store and say, okay, well, my list consists now, instead of from all of them, it's just Lucky Charms and Trix. I only needed 2, so now I'm just looking for where the Lucky Charms and the Trix are, and then I determine what shelf they're on, and then I move on to the next topic shelf. All right. Westchester County might even be too big of a region. So you would say, well, that's going to take like the rest of my life to go to all the Stop and Shops in Westchester County. Maybe I want to go southern Westchester. Right? Maybe I want to stick in the White Plains. White Plains are below. You know, I guess that's southern Westchester. But you know, like create a region that you're interested in, right? Maybe you want to go the other way. Maybe you want to go northern Westchester because it's more spread out and there's less supermarkets to choose from, so less work, you know, you can go that way too, right? But these are some options. You can just go out and collect data from different places. You know, you could also look at it like different stores pretend to be, you know, more aware of health. So maybe you want to do a comparison where you say, okay, well, Whole Foods is supposed to be a healthier option than Stop and Shop. So let's see if they do things differently. Do they put their sugary cereals at eye level for children? All right. What I mean, do they have Lucky Charms and things like that? I don't know, but like whatever their sugary cereal is, like where do they place it? Is it comparable? If so, we could poke a hole in their claim that they're the healthier option because they have their sugary stuff still aimed at drawing in the children. All right, which I think is terrible. He likes Honey Nut Cheerios anyway. So. It's got a little bit of sweet. You know, it's not anything overwhelming. He doesn't like soda. Actually, he doesn't know that whether or not he likes soda because he's never had it before. 9 years old, never had any soda. Yeah. I'm very pleased about that. Never showed interest in it either. I used to drink soda like crazy when I was a teenager. Like I'd drink it by the gallon. Like that was my coffee. Like it was soda instead of coffee. And like I would have all these like gastrointestinal issues. Then I dropped soda and they all went away. And we did in my pre-calc class a bunch of years ago, we did the nail test. I don't know if you ever heard of that. It's you have a pail of soda, and then you put a nail in it, and you take the weight of that nail after a certain period of time. So you put it in day 1, and then day 2 you take its weight. Day 3 take its weight again. Day 4 take its weight again. I forget how many days it was. It was like, but it wasn't any more than 45 days that nail was gone. Right? And it wasn't like anybody took that nail and like they weren't messing with me. They didn't throw the nail away. We have the data. We saw it dissolving. And so that was long after I gave up soda, but that really cemented in my mind, like, what is the purpose of this thing? I'll give you here's a better example. When I'm making pulled pork, what the recipe calls for a cup of Coca-Cola or any kind of cola, and you know the Jamaican jerk spice, which adds a zip to it that I like. But you put the cup of Coca-Cola in there, and then you put it in the slow cooker. That Coca-Cola is to break down the tissue in the pork shoulder, because the pork shoulder is a tough piece of meat. The Coca-Cola is designed to dissolve the tendons in the pork shoulder. Dissolve tissue. Why are we drinking this? Like, so it puts things in perspective. So if you ever drink soda again, I'll be ashamed of you. Anyway, systematic sample. This one's pretty easy to do. Obtained by selecting every kth individual from the population. That kth term sounds weird. Sounds like it's mathy and it would be hard. But replace k with some number. Every 10th individual, every 5th individual, whatever. So you have everybody in your sample lined up, and every 5th value, that individual is going to be part of your sample. So you take 1, 2, 3, 4, you're ignoring all those, take the 5th value, you're in the sample. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, you're in. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, you're in. All right. Another way you can do it is a little bit more loosey-goosey, but it's still systematic. If I were to say that I'm conducting this study, I want to poll students in this building at this time. One thing I could do is a systematic sample would be I want to poll everybody in the front row of their class. In every class throughout the building. The purpose of that study would be, well, I think people that sit in the front row are going to perform better on assessments. All right. So I go into every class and I give the individuals just sitting in the front row a poll, and I just ask them, give me the list of grades that you're earning in this class. And then I collect that data and I do what I'm going to do with it. Okay? The idea being that it should be pretty consistent from one class to another in terms of performance. Right? But the systematic to that component would be the one, first. First what? First anything. First row, first person, first bus load of people. All right, so all different possibilities. Cluster sample obtained by selecting all individuals within a randomly selected collection group of individuals. So it's like blocking when you break the population up into different categories. But cluster sampling, you're taking the entire, like one entire cluster. All right, so that's important, or it is important to know that each cluster must be representative of the population. All right, so if I break up a population of a city or a town based off of income, and so less than 30,000, between 30,000, 50,000, 50,000 to 100,000, 100,000 to 150,000, and so on. And so I broke them up into different categories. And then I randomly select a cluster, and it turns out that the cluster that I selected was the group of people making $350,000 to $400,000 a year. And then I asked them what their opinion is on the government in that area, that local government. That response, whatever it's going to be, is not going to be representative of the entire population. Right? It could be correct. They could actually have the right answer of like what the true conditions are, but they are themselves not representative of the entire population, so therefore that sample is meaningless. All right. So in that context, since each cluster does not represent the population, because not everybody in the population makes $350,000 to $400,000, it would not be an appropriate way to sample the set. In fact, a stratified sample would be more appropriate, because then I could grab a few people from each category, put them together, and then sample them, get the information from them. If each cluster represents the population in some way, then it could be more meaningful. So for example, if I wanted to here create a cluster sample that's based off of the number of semesters that you've been attending the college, right? And then from that information, that set of individuals, the samples, if I wanted to get some information related to maybe something not having anything to do with the structure of the college itself, like just blood pressure or something like that, height, weight, commute time, because let's say you're here for 4 semesters, the way you study might be different from the way you studied your first semester. I was a terrible student my first semester. I thought I was still in high school, right? But my 4th semester, I started, I more than started. I was like a full-blown college student where I knew like what I was supposed to do, right? So you'd want to stay away from academics, but commute time is not unreasonable, right? So I could poll just the people who are here, like in their 4th semester, right? And that should give me the information that I need. It's a cluster, but that cluster should still be representative of the entire population, right? Or at least reasonably representative. That's a word that you're gonna hear a lot in this unit, reasonable, right? Because it's not black and white anymore. There's a lot of gray area when it comes to statistical inference. You don't just say, it is this. You say that there is reasonable evidence to assume that it is this, right? So it's definitely an adjustment because there's no more x equals. All right, probability of x, 1/36? No, we're done with that. Now it's, what do you think? What does this data tell you about the population? All right, a lot more gray area. Convenience sample, honestly, I don't even know why. I don't even know why that's a term. It's in every textbook, online resource. I don't care how easy it is to get a data set. It's a convenience sample which the individuals are easily obtained. Okay, cool. What does that tell us? It doesn't tell us anything, right? I would imagine that you yourselves, when you're deciding on what type of sampling to use, that in addition to trying to figure out which one is the correct way to sample data, you're also going to figure out which one is the easiest one to perform. Like, because I talked about the simple random sample earlier, and I said that that's the easiest, I said that was the hardest one to conduct, but it's the one that removes all bias completely. All right, there's no bias in a simple random sample. It's all completely random, but it's the hardest one to do. So you're very rarely going to want to do a simple random sample. Even though it's the best one to do, it's not practical, right? So we do a stratified random sample, even though it might introduce some variation, it's going to be a little bit easier to do, right? Same thing with cluster sampling. Matched pairs, and you can read through voluntary response, that's the worst one ever. So like on a multiple choice question, the only way that that's going to be the right answer to a question is, which of the following is the absolute worst way to collect data? Right, that's voluntary response. Right. Matched pairs, one sample is drawn and 2 measurements are taken. Most often it's before and after, but as long as it's 1 sample and 2 measurements, you're good to go. All right. An example that I like to use is left and right-handed dexterity. So if you have a task that you need to perform with the left hand and with the right hand, measure the amount of time that it takes to do both. You yourself are part of the sample, but 2 measurements are taken. It's not a before and after situation. It's just 2 separate measurements, right? One of my relatives is a surgeon, orthopedic surgeon, and he told me, and this was like an extension of an activity that I used to do. What I used to do was one of those kids' toys that had the cutouts on the top. It was a box. The top of the box had a cutout in the shape of a triangle, a star, a circle, and then you had the corresponding shapes. And then the kid would have to try to put, it's for like toddlers, infants, toddlers. they would have to try to put the shape in the box through the corresponding hole. So it was a processing thing. You have to say, well, I can't get this circle into the star hole, so let me try the star. All right. So that changed because he said that in order to be a surgeon, you have to have dexterity in both your left and right hand, which requires brain processing on both sides. Right. So what he told me is that not every other day, but very often he'll brush his teeth with his offhand. All right, so he's right-handed, so he'll brush his teeth with his left hand. He'll comb his hair with his left hand. You know, I can't do that, but you know, like he'll do things like that he would normally do with his right hand. He'll do it with his left hand, just to activate the center of his brain, that part of his brain that focuses on that part of his body. All right, and so that's something that you could do as part of a data set. Now, it is kind of, there's some gray area in that too, because let's say you wanted to do a study where every other day you brush your teeth with the offhand, right? How do you collect that data? Me personally, I would think timer, right? I would continue brushing until I feel like I've finished brushing, and then I'd look at the clock, right? And then the next day I do it with my left hand. The problem with that is there's the perception, the human part of it. Right? So you're lefty, so maybe you brush your teeth when you do it with your right hand, subconsciously you're doing it slower because you think you're supposed to do it slower, right? Or maybe you just did a crappy job brushing your teeth that day because you're like, well, I could do it just as fast with my right hand as I can with my left hand, and then you miss half your mouth, right? So there's some wiggle room there where you have to be careful, but it's an example of a way that you could apply matched pairs to a situation. Driving, it could apply with driving also, because really any kind of condition that would happen before and after, you know, so gas mileage. Now, I read a study at one point that said that your gas mileage with a full tank of gas is not as good as it is when you have less gas in your tank. And it makes sense because less gas means less weight. If your car weighs less, it's going to be more economical with its MPG. So you fill up a tank of gas. Before you fill up the tank of gas, you get some instant readings on your MPG just from the screen. And then after you fill up the tank of gas, get some, drive at the same speed and just see what the difference is between your MPG. That seems perfectly reasonable, right? You'd have to control some other variables that come into play. Like, for example, if you're gunning it after filling up the tank of gas, that's going to skew some things if you weren't gunning it before filling up the tank of gas, right? But that's another case of matched pairs, right? Another medical case would be blood pressure before you take the pill, blood pressure after you take the pill, right? That's an easy one, all right? So the process for designing an experiment or an observational study, it's very straightforward because really all you're doing is identifying the different characteristics that go into the study. So you want to talk about the problem that needs to be solved, all right? So is Vicodin effective? We have to identify the explanatory and response variables. All right, so the input variable is the explanatory. So that would be the amount of Vicodin. Response. A lot of room for your perception to come into play here, because pain's kind of an iffy topic, right? So amount of pain, change in pain, You can go in a couple of different directions with this. I'll say amount of pain. This thing is like deciding on the fly what letters it wants to make. The factors that affect the response variable. All right, factors. So here we're thinking about anything that might affect the response variable. If these are not kept under control, they become lurking variables and they screw up the whole study.
Can you include anything with the side effects?
Yeah, anything you can think of.
Would that be under factors?
That would be under factors also. So side effects. I was thinking about those allergy commercials, where it's like it'll make you breathe right, but one of the side effects is death. So yeah, that medicine didn't really work if you're dead. So can't breathe well if you can't breathe. So side effects, physiology. Like what kind of physical shape are you in going into the situation? I guess environmental conditions. I didn't always include stuff like that, but when the temperature dropped below 40 degrees, I started having the old T-Rex arms in the morning. So my level of pain is definitely impacted by the environment. And we talked about the barometric pressure study that I did. So, there's some things that you're not aware of until you're aware of it, You don't experience it directly. It's not something you necessarily think of. Now, we're not doctors yet, but there are some things using common sense that you can come up with. Now, do you have to come up with them all? Of course not, because there's a lot of things that you'd have to go to medical school in order to fully understand, right? But there's some things that you could reasonably consider. Yeah, I think that's probably good enough. But you could get into things like stress level, right? So stress and pain are related to one another. I know that pain and blood pressure are related to one another. So I know pain, increase in pain leads to an increase in blood pressure. Is the other way around true? I have no idea, but it's something to be mindful of. There's some characteristics that can come into play. All right. Determine the sample size. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Sample size, 12-ish. I'll just say 12 because I know she stepped out, but 12 is a nicer number than 13. The level of the response variable. All right, the level of response, nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio. Well, it depends on how we're defining pain. All right, so, and this is where you have a lot of wiggle room. I'm going to say scale of 1 to 10. All right, instead of going from that scale of smiley face to like the face with the X eyes and it's like I'll do a smiley face first. Okay, so you have that, and then it's like that one. Yeah, that was an attempt there. And then there's like this one where it's like, I mean, it's really just asking for a scale of 1 to 10, but, using symbols. I don't know how that's any better. You could go from a scale of 0 to 10, I suppose, but I would probably shy away from that in this example only because you're taking Vicodin. You're not taking it because you have a hangnail. You're taking it because you had like root canal or you had a wisdom tooth pulled. Yeah, like it's not going to take away all the pain. You know, so I mean, but if you want to leave room for that to be a possible outcome, sure, you can make it 0 to 10. All right, that's going to affect the level of response. All right, so based on my scale of 1 to 10, I'm going to say it's interval level. And because 0 is not in the set, not a possibility. All right, based on the way I define things. You might have defined it differently, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Professor, so the level of response, it's based on the amount of pain?
Yes. Now, it is possible that you could, I mean, if you define response as change in pain, it's a different way of thinking about it. Your level of response would be based on that. Then 0 could be a meaningful value, because 0 would just mean that there is no change in your pain. It is possible you take a medication and your pain is so severe that it just has no effect. Right? Again, this is perception. So 0 doesn't necessarily have to mean that there's no real change in your pain. It's just that you're not perceiving any change in your pain. All right. Now, collect your sample using randomization and replication. Just to make it easier and also to protect your privacy, I guess, because this is going up on the internet, I'll just use numbers and break those numbers up into a control and experimental group. All right, so 1, 3. Now, if you want to go old school, what you do, I mean, and this is really old school, you actually flip a coin. Person number 1, heads, control, tails, experimental. Okay, you're in control. You know, but we have technology that we could use, so that's what we'll do. I'll just put it. So, just going back to the last unit, math, probability, random integer. So again, that's math, probability, random integer. All right, so what I want to do is pull from this set of data however many people I want to be in each sample. All right, so if I want to break them up, I want to split them evenly from one group to the other. I got 12 people, that makes sense. I want 6 in my control and 6 in my experimental. What I can do is do a random selection from 1 to 12 and just do it. I could do it 12 times. I could do it, if I'm worried about repeats, I could do it more than that. I'm using this technique because not all the calculators have, there's a function called random no repeat. So that would be nice if all the calculators had that, but it's not always the case. So what I would do is I put in my lower number and my higher number, which is 1 and 10, no, 1 and 12. I was thinking of the scale for a second there. And then just put in some large value of n. It really doesn't matter what it is as long as it's bigger than 12, because the random integer allows for repeats, and I can't put a person in a control group more than once. So I want to allow for the case that maybe there's some repeats involved. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put 20 in there. And again, that's to allow for repeats. And I'll show you what that means in a second. Or maybe I won't, depending on how the random data comes out. All right, so this allows for repeats. All right, so then I go to paste and hit enter. And from this, I just want the first 6 values. All right, first 6 values are going into the control group. All right, so first 6, So I'll just paste this in here. First 6 unique values are going into the control group. I just wanted to allow for repeats because it's possible I could have gotten like 12 3 times, you know? So it will allow me to have a few more numbers to play with. So first 6 go into the control. This pen is brutal. All right, so I'll just highlight the ones that I want. So it actually turned out that there were no repeated values, which is good, but there could have been, and I didn't want to take that chance. And you could see that the 8th value there was a 5 again. And then I got a 12 again. Okay, so I would have got some repeats if I was not careful. So just giving myself more wiggle room allows me to disregard any repeated values. So my control group would be the set of individuals 12, 11, 2, 7, 5, and 9. They're getting the placebo. The experimental group is getting the Vicodin. So I'll just say drug. Try to keep it vague so that we can apply this to other situations. So that's everyone else, all right? So these are the folks that are getting the control. So my experimental group will be 1, 3, 4, 6, 8, 10. All right, so now I know who's getting what. And then I can collect the data related to those individuals. So I would ask them, how are you feeling? But then I would give them the medicine, ask them again how they're feeling, and then compare. Right, so that's the part that we just want to diagram that out because I don't have any drugs for you. So we can't actually carry it out. Also, I wouldn't, even if I did. All right, so, because that is not legal, apparently. So we have our sample that we're going to break up into a control and experimental group. We're going to determine pain before. In both cases. So the question would be pain before what? Pain before the placebo. Pain before the Vicodin, or the drug if you want to keep it general. Then I need the pain after. And then I want to compare the two. All right, so the only remaining question really is, like, how am I going to conduct this? Like, am I going to do it as a blind experiment, a double-blind experiment? Well, it all depends on who is designating the pain. It seems like it's only the patient that's reporting the pain. So we don't really care about the perception necessarily of the administrator, but you can't go wrong if you make it a double-blind experiment. It just requires that extra level of protection. So it's a question of finances at that point, because if you have to hire people to help you conduct this study, then maybe you do it as a blind study so that you don't have to hire somebody to administer the drugs for you. So in that case, I would say that this is a blind study. Because really it was just a choice between blind and double blind, because it wouldn't make any sense to give a person a placebo and then tell them that they have a placebo. That would defeat the purpose of having the placebo to begin with. All right. So that's really how we design a study, because after that it's test, apply your selected treatment and then test the claim. We haven't learned how to test claims yet. We're going to do that next week. All right. So at this point, it's just how do we develop a study, an appropriately developed study, so that once we have our data, we can draw conclusions about an entire population. Because, if I'm creating an experimental drug, they come out all the time. How do they say it's made it through clinical trials, it's waiting for FDA approval? What are those clinical trials? Well, these are those clinical trials, right? And so this is the structure of those clinical trials, and it all depends how these or how the data are analyzed that will determine whether something becomes FDA approved. All right, so a lot of interesting stuff in this, and definitely meaningful stuff. All right, so yeah, so that's where we're going to pick up next class, and we're going to talk about the vocabulary behind a hypothesis test, which is very important stuff. All right, so that's where we're going to leave it for today. I will.